How to write an opening sentence. The first sentence of an essay sets the tone for the rest of the paper. For this reason, it is one of the most important sentences in the entire work. To write an effective opening sentence, there are two things you must consider: specificity and engagement. In high school, we likely all had teachers who said something to the effect of, "Start broad and go narrow." This sounds like great advice. However, the problem is that students usually start too broadly. Many students, for instance, start with "throughout history." As a result, it takes a long time to pare the text down from the broad opening to a specific topic. This adds to your word count and makes the purpose of your essay unclear. Moreover, if you're writing about a contemporary issue, such as cyberbullying, this approach is simply not applicable. For example, it's not like cavemen were cyberbullying each other on Twitter, and neither were ancient samurai warriors communicating via WeChat, nor were cowboys in America's western frontier lassoing up likes on Facebook. So, if we don't start from broad and go narrow, what do we do? Instead, we should start narrow and get specific. This is easy to say, but how can we apply this in practice? Let's say you have to write an essay about Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And in this essay, you have to explore the ways in which the play challenges traditional gender roles. How might you begin the essay? Could we start off with "throughout history" in this context? No. Unfortunately, Shakespeare wrote in the Elizabethan era specifically, so this is too broad. What if we start off with "in Elizabethan England"? Does this work? No. Unfortunately, it's still too broad. Shakespeare was not the only playwright in Elizabethan England. What if we start off with "in Shakespeare's play"? This is narrower. Unfortunately, it's still too broad. Shakespeare was the author of over 30 different plays. Perhaps we could start off with "Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet challenges gender in a number of ways." Does this work? Yes, this is exactly as specific as you need to be. The reader will have a clear understanding of the author you're talking about, the play that you're talking about, and the framework in which you're going to place it. This establishes a narrow scope for your conversation. From here, you can then introduce the more specific ideas that will make up the substance of your body paragraphs. For example, you might allude to the ways in which Juliet demonstrated characteristics that would culturally be associated with masculinity. You might also discuss how Romeo demonstrated what would typically be considered as feminine characteristics. These would be the specific subjects that make up the body paragraphs of your essay. You begin with the narrow scope of conversation and then introduce your specific ideas. And this is how specific you need to be when you're beginning your essay. Now we know how specific we need to be when introducing our topic. But how do we do this in a way that's going to elicit and engage our reader's interest? Your opening sentence should ideally spark the reader's curiosity and compel them to want to read the rest of your paper. To achieve this, you must turn that introductory sentence into a hook. There are several kinds of hooks that are in your toolbox. We'll go over some of the most common and effective approaches: rhetorical question, statistics, anecdote, definition, unconventional or strong position, quotation, and interesting fact. One of the most common hooks that you'll come across is the rhetorical question. This serves two purposes. First, it makes your reader curious about the answer to the question you're posing. Second, it establishes a clear goal for your paper. This is a common approach used in online clickbait articles. For example, you might see some websites that post article titles that say something to the effect of, "Do you want to lose 10 pounds in 1 week?" This might be effective, but in an academic context, it's important that you use a more subtle and professional approach. For instance, maybe you have to write an essay on animal rights. In this case, you might start with a simple question relating to your topic. Should animals be protected by law? This will tell your reader that the purpose of the essay is to address this question. Rhetorical questions are effective, especially when you're speaking publicly. However, use this approach with caution. Rhetorical questions are technically written in second person because you're speaking directly to the reader. This can be a problem in academic writing, where you're typically expected to write in third person. As a result, many teachers see this approach as being informal. Thus, if you decide to use this approach, be sure that it conforms to your instructor's expectations. Opening with a statistic is also an effective way to grab the reader's attention. Showing alarming stats can highlight how prevalent and far-reaching an issue is. This may also encourage the reader to see how an issue applies to them, thereby making them invested in the topic. Let's use some hypothetical numbers to illustrate this point. As a human kinetics major, you might write a paper on heart disease. You could open up with a statement that underscores its prevalence. Over 55% of Americans die of heart disease. This underscores how far-reaching the phenomenon is and could encourage the reader to consider how this might impact their own lives. However, when you're using statistics, it's important to present the stats in an effective way. If you're talking about a less prevalent issue, you might use raw numbers instead of percentages. Let's assume you're a psychology major writing about schizophrenia. You might start off with something like 1.5% of Americans suffer from schizophrenia. This is a significant and tragically high number, but does 1.5% sound like a lot? If we look at a pie chart, it certainly doesn't look like a lot. In these contexts, we might consider using raw data or raw numbers instead of percentages. But what does that look like? If you do choose raw numbers, it might sound something like this. Over 5 million Americans suffer from schizophrenia. The 5 million and 1.5% are approximately the same number, but 5 million sounds like significantly more. Likewise, instead of focusing on the percentage of the general population, you might focus on the percentage of the target population. For instance, you could write over 80% of people with schizophrenia are hospitalized because their disorder is not treated properly. In this context, the numbers will seem as significant as they actually are because you're focusing on the target population instead of the general population. However, there are contexts in which neither the percentages nor the raw numbers sound very significant. If you're a social work major, you might find yourself writing a paper about homelessness in Windsor. You could start off with, Windsor's homeless rate is just over 2%, but that does sound meager, as tragic as that may be. The raw number would look something like over 200 residents in Windsor are homeless. Again, though tragic, this number might not seem compelling to some people. In these contexts, you could focus on growth instead of raw numbers or percentages. Windsor's homeless population has increased by 200% in the last 5 years. This highlights that this is a growing problem and underscores the importance of addressing it. Therefore, whenever you're choosing to open your paper with statistics, always consider how you can frame them in a compelling way to most effectively elicit your reader's interest. An anecdote is likewise an effective way to open your paper and grab your reader's attention. This approach is often used in conjunction with statistics. An anecdote is simply a story or narrative. In the context of your opening line, you would ideally introduce an anecdote that conveys the purpose of your paper. This is especially effective when you're asked to write critical self-reflections about your experiences. This type of assignment is common in fields like education, nursing, and social work. Perhaps you're an education major writing about online engagement in the classroom. You could outline your own experiences. Several of my students shied away from participating in class. However, when I created an online discussion board, these same students became eager to contribute. This approach can also be used in third-person contexts. For instance, if you're writing an essay about the effects of depression, you could use a tragic narrative to underscore the severity of the issue. Beloved comedian Robin Williams was famous for making people laugh. However, after a decades-long battle with depression, he tragically committed suicide. This kind of a narrative can be effective because it's easier for one person to identify with and empathize with a single person than it is for an overwhelming statistic. One of the key issues with this approach is that anecdotes aren't typically seen as sufficient evidence. Therefore, it is best to pair this approach with statistics. For example, after demonstrating the impact that depression can have on an individual, you could put this in a broader statistical context. For example, after introducing an anecdote, you might go on to write, "This is a growing concern as over 80% of Canadians will struggle with depression at some point in their lives." This reinforces the fact that the anecdote is not an anomalous occurrence, but rather an example that is emblematic of a prevalent problem that the reader should take seriously. When opening an essay, many students begin by introducing a definition. This can be effective. However, it has limits. For example, I had a nursing student who once brought me a paper on childhood drowning. She began by defining what drowning meant. However, most people already know what drowning is. In this case, I suggested that she start with the statistic instead. For example, drowning is the #1 cause of death among children under the age of 6. This begs the question, when should we use definitions? There are two instances when they're most effective. First, when you're introducing a term that your readers likely don't know. Also, when you're challenging a conventional definition. For example, you might be writing a philosophy paper that uses terms your readership might not be familiar with. In this case, it would be a good idea to define your key term. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, epistemology is defined as a theory about knowledge that focuses on the methods through which knowledge is obtained. Perhaps you're writing a sociology paper in which you're tasked with deconstructing the concept of race. You might begin by challenging the conventional contemporary definition of race by offering an older version in its place. For example, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, race is defined by, quote, "common characteristics," quote, "not differences." In this context, it's always important to use trusted sources. Using dictionary.com or Urban Dictionary does not give your definition much credit. Instead, try using reputable dictionaries or encyclopedias, such as the Oxford English Dictionary. Asserting an unconventional or strong position can also be an effective way to grab your reader's attention. This is especially true when paired with a conflicting position. But how does this work? Let us assume that you are an education major. In this context, most people would probably agree that equality is good and that schools should promote equality. Thus, to shock your reader, you might open with a contrary statement. Schools should not promote equality. Your reader might be alarmed by this position and therefore curious as to why you hold it. You can then follow that up with your position. Instead, schools should promote equity. The first clause shocks your reader. The second clause encourages them to consider the differences between the words equality and equity. In business, Corporations often put the interests of stockholders above all else. If you're writing a human resource paper about prioritizing the needs of employees, you could challenge this way of thinking with an opening sentence that goes as follows. Corporations should not put their shareholders first. They should put their employees first. Such an approach can be used to underscore the focus of your essay while arousing your reader's curiosity. Some students choose to open their essays with a quote from a celebrated figure in their field of study. This kind of quote is called an epigraph, and it's from two Greek words, epi, meaning upon, and graph, meaning writing. There are several benefits to this. Firstly, it allows you to encapsulate a key issue or idea that you will be discussing in an articulate and engaging manner. Secondly, it allows you to borrow credibility from the author whom you've quoted. And thirdly, it shows your readers that you're familiar with the experts in the field. But how can you apply this approach effectively? Let's assume you're still writing that human resource paper on the importance of supporting your employees. In this case, rather than using a contradictory position, you might use a quote from a credible source. Doug Conant, CEO of Campbell's Soup, once said that to win the marketplace, you must first win the workplace. Maybe you're a political science major writing an essay on identity politics. You could start with a quote about why people are so reluctant to change political affiliations. For example, American novelist Mark Twain is attributed with saying, "It is easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled." In both these instances, the quote encapsulates the topic you are discussing and calls on an authority figure or recognized intellectual. This helps to introduce your topic in an engaging way. You can also grab your reader's attention by opening with an interesting fact. For instance, I had a philosophy student who was tasked with responding to a thought-provoking question. Do you need property to be happy? She began her essay by summarizing the history behind a celebrated quote from Thomas Jefferson. Rather than advocating for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Jefferson originally advocated for life, liberty, and property. This begs the question, do you need property to be happy? Now, given the fact that Jefferson was a slave owner, he's obviously an extremely problematic historical figure to say the least. That said, the history behind this quote does encapsulate the purpose of the essay quite succinctly. Perhaps you're a gender studies major writing a paper on how gender is socially constructed. You might open with a fact that points to how certain behaviors assumed to be innately feminine or masculine were not originally seen that way. For example, when high heels were originally designed, they were worn exclusively by men. There are other ways to begin a paper. These are just a few strategies that have proven effective. If you have other ideas that you think will be effective in introducing your essay, don't feel like you have to limit yourself to these options. Be creative and try to find a way to engage your readers. Final thoughts. When beginning your essay, it's important that you consider how to do this in an effective way. First, make sure that you narrow the scope of your opening statement to your specific topic. Then, consider which hook or hooks would be most effective for your paper. This will ensure that the first sentence of your essay will instill the reader with a clear set of expectations and set an engaging tone for the rest of your paper. Be sure to consider how these approaches can enhance your writing. And if you need individualized support, be sure to book an appointment with the Writing Support Desk through My Success. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.